Stitches in Noblesville, and the month is half over. It's November 15th, 2021. I bet you guys always are wondering, why do I say the date? Well, that's because in, 20 years, somebody might be watching this video and thinking that we're still in business, or that we still have this fabric, or that we're still doing the same old thing. So I just kind of want to give a sense of where we are in time continuum, or whatever that is. What is that word? Time. You know what I'm saying. You've watched enough of that show. What is that show called? The Big Bang Theory. Time continuum, whatever. So anyway, we're back, and today I wanted to kind of redo a video that I've already done before. This was when I first started working here about over a year ago, and we did it on Facebook. We weren't doing YouTube videos at that time, and so it is still in our lineup, but I kind of rethought it a little bit, and maybe can make a little bit better understanding of it. And now it'll be in our YouTube Meet Me at the Sew Machine playlist, and we'll always be able to find it there. It's going to be, so why a fat quarter? That's what it's going to be called. So why a fat quarter, you ask? Well, I'm going to show you why a fat quarter. I got 3 yards of fabric here. Okay, this fuchsia one, this teal colored one, and this blackish brown one. And I wanted to show you that the salvages are here. From here to here is the salvage. Now that means that it's the length of the width of the fabric, the width of the fabric, W-O-F. When you see that in a pattern that says cut, W-O-F, that means they want you to cut salvage to salvage, width of fabric. Who sets up how much is the width of fabric? Well, the manufacturer does. And it all depends upon their looms, how big of a piece of fabric. Fabric today goes up to 120 inches. You can buy fabric that's 120 inches wide. That is wide. Deep and wide, deep. Did you ever sing that song when you were in Sunday school? Okay, well, anyway, wide. It can be 120 wide. It used to be only 36 inches wide. Little tiny bolts. They were so cute back in the Little House on the Prairie days. You can watch some of their shows and you can see they're buying little bitty bolts. It's so cute. But today, the average cotton quilting fabric comes 45 inches wide, give or take, okay? And the reason I say give or take depends upon how big the salvage is. Some artists like to put a big old decorative salvage on. So there's a big old piece of salvage that you have to cut off of both ends. And that reduces your amount of usable fabric. So typically, though, it should be 45 inches wide before you take off the salvages. All right? That's important to know. You don't buy the fabric by the width unless you're buying wide backs. Typically, when you come into a quilt store and you see those typical bolts that are about that big, well, they'd be about that big. Anyway, those are folded in half, 45 wide, so 42 and a half inches when they're folded in half. And you don't buy it by the width. The width is set by the manufacturer, okay? You buy it by the length. And so here I've got the little chart. Oh, this should be the other way around. Width of fabric, length of fabric. This is the length of fabric. Sorry, I do have it right. This is the length of fabric. This is 1 yard. So how big is it from here to here? Well, a yard of fabric is 36 inches long here in America. You know, that metric and all that other stuff that I don't know anything about because I was born and raised in Anderson, Indiana, and all I know is inches, okay? Forgive me. I'm not worldly. I wish I was, but I'm not. So anyway, you buy the fabric by the length. And it just so happens I bought a yard of this, a yard of this, and a yard of that. Could I have bought more? Well, sure, I could have bought the whole bolt. When it comes on the bolt, like I said, it's usually folded in half. Lengthwise. Okay, so it's folded in half lengthwise. So it's usually wrapped around the bolt like this. And you take the bolt up to the cashier and you say, I'd like to have a yard, please. Well, she takes it and she undoes it like this.
Or he.
And she undoes it and she undoes it, or he, they. And then they cut you a piece that's a yard long. Now here at Always in Stitches, we give you an inch or so extra because we know that when it comes from the manufacturer, it's not always straight. So we always like to give a little extra so that we make sure when you get home and you straighten out your fabric, you have a yard of usable fabric. Okay? So that's what a yard looks like when you buy it at the quilt shop. All right? Now let's take 36 inches and let's divide 36 in half. Now I'm getting it all straight up here. It's straight on my line here. I'm going to cut a half a yard. I'll move it down so I can see my inches. There we go. And a half a yard is 18 inches. 18 and 18 is 36. A yard is 36 inches, so half of that yard is 18. So I'm going to lay my ruler down on the 18. I'm using a mat because I don't have a ruler big enough. I'm using the measurements on my mat. And that's what a half looks like. Now if I cut that in half, what's half of 18? Anybody know? It's 9. 9 plus 9 is 18. Now when we start getting into fractions, I may have to use my toes. But anyway, I'm going to cut here on 9. 9 and 9 is 18. 9 times 4 is 36. So out of a yard, I can get 2 halves. I can get a half and 2 quarters. Or I can get 4 quarters. What if I wanted an eighth of a yard? Well, that's 4 1/2. I know that 4 1/2 and 4 1/2 equals 9. So I'm going to lay my ruler down at the 4 1/2. And I'm going to get me an eighth. So I can have a half, a fourth, and an eighth. I can have 8 eighths. I can have 4 fourths. And I can have 2 halves. And any combination of those we're in. You understand what I'm saying? Shake your head, Peter, so people can hear you. Okay. So that's how you break down an eighth and a quarter and a half. Let's open them up and see what you get. Let me take this teal one off first. Now, so far, I have cut it the way you buy it off the bolt. By the length of the fabric. This is the width, this is the length, and I've been cutting the length of the fabric. So if I open this up, see how this is, see how this is a half of a yard? See, now these are not the same width. I spray starched this one a little bit much today, so it's a little bit shrunk. But see how if I took 2 of those, I'd have a half and a half, and then I'd have a whole yard. See that? Now, what about a quarter? What does it look like? Well, a quarter of a yard looks like this. Can they see that, Peter?
Yes.
I'm going to leave a little space so that they can make a determination. Okay, can they see the difference in that?
Uh-huh.
Okay, now I'm going to show you what an eighth of a yard looks like. I don't know if they'll be able to see this low or not, but we'll try it. Can they see that?
Yep.
Okay, good. Good. He's a good photographer, people. Here's my pen. So a half, a quarter, and an eighth. So let's say, for instance, you are making a pillow. And your pillow is 12 and a half by 12 and a half. You're going to have to buy a whole half a yard because this is 18 inches wide to get one 12 and a half inch piece out of that. Okay? Let's say if you wanted a 10-inch piece of fabric, you're going to have to buy a whole half a yard to get a 10-inch square out of it. Okay? So somebody much smarter than me, much savvier than me, much prettier than me probably, developed fats. Now, I can relate to that. They made something I could relate to. That's good. Now, fats are something that you cut not by the width of the fabric, not by the length of the fabric, excuse me, not by the length like we just did, but by the width of the fabric. Now, the width of the fabric is from salvage to salvage. Remember that? Salvage to salvage. That's the width. So if I opened this up, there'd be a salvage down here and a salvage down here. Salvage to salvage. Now I'm going to cut along the width of the fabric. Could I have gotten any bigger scissors there, Peter? I'm telling you, I've got to go get some bigger scissors. Hang on one moment. Can you pause me?
Do you have any in your...
No, I don't. Can you pause me?
I can grab them. You got a whole basket back there.
No, those don't work, Peter. Okay, I'm back. I brought these from the shipping department. I bet they're paper scissors, but they'll do the job, hopefully. You know, I should have brought my nice gingers. What was I thinking, huh? I wasn't thinking this far in. Okay, I'm cutting the width of the fabric. Remember before, I was cutting this way. Now I'm cutting along this fold. And I'm really chewing this fabric up with these paper scissors. This is a quilt store you know we'd have. You know we have fabric scissors around here somewhere.
Dawn spends all her money on rulers.
Yeah.
And pin cushions.
Uh-huh. Okay. So now here was my half a yard before, right? Just gonna lay these over there. And here's my half a yard now. This half goes this way. See how two of these make a yard? See that? Now this is 18 by 36. No, 20, I'm sorry. This is half of 45. This is 22 and a half. Excuse me. This is 22 and a half by 36. So what if I needed a 20-inch square? Well, a fat half would be the way to go. if you didn't want to buy a whole bunch of fabric. Well, really it wouldn't. If you wanted a big strip of fabric, a long strip and wide strip, a fat half would be a way to go. I don't know very many quilt shops that cut fat halves. Do you, Peter?
No, I don't know of one.
I don't know of any. Now, in my shop, when I owned my shop, I would have, if somebody would have asked me to cut a fat half, I certainly would have. A half a yard of fabric is a half a yard of fabric to me, no matter which way you cut it. Okay, so we cut on the fold. Okay, did you see that? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold it in half this way, and I'm going to cut the half of a yard in half. That was a fat half. If you cut a fat half in half, you get, what do you think you get, Peter?
Something fat.
Something fat. Fat quarters. So see how this is a quarter of that? So this is 22, approximately 22 and a half by 18. Let's compare that to a quarter of a yard. So this is where I'm getting my big square from. If I needed an 18-inch square, I could get it out of this. I wouldn't have to buy a whole half a yard. See that? If I needed a big square, I'd much rather buy a fat quarter of fabric than a big skinny long piece of fabric. I still got 4. There's still 4 of these because it's still a fourth of a yard. This fabric right here is the same amount of fabric as this is. If I cut this in half right here and laid it end to end, it'd be the exact same fabric. It's still a quarter of a yard. Same amount of fabric, same, in some shops it's the same price, in others they add a little more for labor because it does take a lot more labor to make and fold fat quarters than to just sell you a quarter of a yard right off the bolt. And then if I take this fat quarter and I cut it in half and cut on the fold, this becomes a fat eighth. So there's 8 of these. So 4 fit across there and 4 fit across there. That's an eighth, a fat eighth. So let me take this off. Let me take this off. And let me put an eighth of a yard out. Let me take this one off. I'm going to put up my eighth of a yard again. Now, I know it's hard to believe that this strip and this piece are the same exact amount of fabric. They really are. If I cut this in half this way and I laid it end to end, it would be the same amount of fabric. This is a regular eighth. This is a fat eighth. It's a fat quarter cut in half the fat way. Not the long way, but the fat way. So do you see how that works? Isn't that interesting? Well, why in the world would I want to buy a fat quarter instead of a regular quarter? Well, again, if you need a thicker, chunkier piece of fabric, if you're just doing strips, you know, let's say, for instance, you're making half square triangles and you're using thangles, which we've talked about in the past, and you just need strips, by all means, come in and buy just a strip of fabric, you know. however wide you want it, however long you want it. That width and length, it gets to you. Width, you don't buy fabric by the width unless you're buying 108 or 120 inch backing fabric. Typically, it's 45. So we're just going to be talking about 45 width. You buy fabric by the length. Okay? So, 36 inches. This would be 9 inches by 22 and a half. This would be 4.5 inches by 45. So, depending on what your needs are, depends upon how you buy your fabric. Now, how all this came about, I have not a clue. I wish I knew. Back in the olden days, when Tammy, my friend Tammy, if you saw our interview, you got to meet Tammy, we were cutting fat quarters and fat eighths and fat halves, and we were making charm packs before there were charm packs. We didn't even know what to call them. We just called them 5-inch squares. We mostly did them out of flannels because we had a little flannel quilt, little flannel baby quilt in our shop, and we just stacked a bunch of 5-inch squares together, and people bought them, and we thought that was great, so we started cutting 5-inch squares out of everything. But the manufacturers caught on to what the quilt shop owners were doing, and they decided that they were going to make fat quarter bundles and fat eighth bundles and jelly rolls and, you know, all the pre-cuts, all kinds of pre-cuts. If there's a pre-cut out there in any fun shape or size, they got it. It's out there. But we don't buy our fat quarter bundles from the manufacturer. We make our own so that we can sell them to you cheaper. We sell our fat quarter bundles for the price they come off the bolt. Now, our fabric that is just laying around in fat quarters, those are fat quarter prices. But when we put a collection together of the whole family of fabrics, so fabric comes in SKUs. Each fabric design is called a SKU. And typically they have 40 to 42 SKUs in a line of fabric. Well, do you want to buy 30 to 42 just regular quarters? Do you want to buy 42 half yards? That gets to be quite costly. So what they decided to do was to make fat quarters. And it seemed like you were getting more fabric. You weren't. They were the same amount of fabric, but it was a bigger, fatter chunk of fabric. So you could do more with it, really. So this is why when you come into our store, you see these beautiful bundles that are all wrapped up with a pretty ribbon. Jennifer and our team, they do that for you. And you can buy an entire collection, and it's more affordable than having to stand while somebody cuts 42 quarter of a yards for you. So it gives you a chance to buy the entire collection. You know, all the fabric's going to go together. What I like to do when I buy a fat quarter bundle is I like to pick out my favorite fabrics and buy a couple yards of each one of those to go with. So maybe I would have an outer border, or if there was a focus print, I could maybe build a block around that focus print, so I would buy more of that focus print. And then it just makes it so nice. You take it home, you put it on your shelf, if you can dare to break into it. Because I tell you what, I got some at home that I can't really stand to break into. If you can stand to break into it, then you've got a ready-made quilt pretty much, okay? So, especially if you want to do something scrappy. And I love that. I love a scrappy quilt. So I hope that cleared it up for you a little bit. Why a fat quarter? It's the same amount of fabric. It's just a fatter piece of fabric. Do you buy fabric by the width? No, you buy fabric by the length. So you're either buying a yard, a half yard, maybe you're buying the whole bolt. That would be fine with us. We don't care. We think it's awesome if you want to buy a whole bolt. We'll give you a discount if you want to buy a whole bolt. But if you're just wanting a yard or 2 yards, that's just great. But if you want a quarter of a yard and you need it to be fat, that's when you choose to buy a fat quarter. And so that's clear as mud, I'm sure. If you have any questions, you can call Peter or put them in the comments, because Peter's our question and answering guy. And he will fill you in on all the details. And next Monday, which is the 22nd, I won't be here. I'll be in Texas setting up the new classroom, the new sewing room at Moda at the new warehouse. And I'm very excited about that. And I'm going to get to see the new fabrics, of course, and play with those. And so I'm doubly excited about that. And I'm sure I'll be cutting some fat quarters. So stay tuned. Come back and see us. I think the next time I'll be here, it'll even be past Thanksgiving. So happy Thanksgiving, everybody. And enjoy your family. Enjoy your sewing time. And meet me back at the Sew Machine on the 29th of November. Can you believe it? The 29th of November. Crazy. Bye-bye.